So now it's time to talk about classification. How do we classify all these life forms we've been talking about evolving in the previous part of this unit? We use evolutionary history now. In the past, it used to be that biologists had discussions on just physical similarities and differences, and they classified according to their impression on how related life forms were based on physical features. Now we actually use cladistics, which is in its purest form, it's a binary matrix method of determining the pattern of derived and ancestral characteristics relating a group of life forms and the classification that results from that. The cladistical analysis of organisms on Earth and recent discoveries, actually in the last 30 to 40 years, show that we have on Earth, it appears, three basic, broadly distinguished groups of organisms. They are the eubacteria, which are the most primitive of the types of organisms on Earth. These are prokaryotes, meaning they don't have any membrane-bound organelles in their cells. Some members of this group are photosynthetic. Other members are heterotrophic and feed almost like an animal, except they don't have mouths. They just grow into their food source. Some of them are parasites. Most of them are decomposers. Some of them are aerobic. Some of them are anaerobic, meaning oxygen kills them. They have real simple DNA control systems. And they use phospholipid ester-based cell membranes. We'll talk more about ester linkage later, but it has to do with the types of bonds between glycerol and fatty acids in their phospholipid membranes. The second group, which is a little closer to us, is the archaeans. Archaeans are also single-celled prokaryotic organisms, so they appear as biofilm and plankton forms like bacteria floating in the water. They have differences in their characteristics, though, that make them not bacteria. One of the things that makes them different is their phospholipids are unusual in that they are not ester-based, but they're ether-based. Ether-based water would be the simplest ether. An ether, let's erase everything. I'll see if I can draw this on the side. Ethers are molecules that are bridged by an oxygen atom. In its purest form, water is kind of an ether. H and H here are stuck with single bonds to O. If I take the eraser here and I erase this H, and let's say I just put a carbon atom here. This is now a carbon atom with hydrogen sticking off. That's a bad looking hydrogen atom there. This is methyl ether. Actually, this is methanol, okay, CH3OH. But if we now take this H off on the other side, take that off, and we put a carbon atom there, we end up with dimethyl ether. Like that. So this bridge is different than this bridge. The ester bridge is this. There's a C double bond O here and an O here. This, then, you have a molecule stuck here and a molecule stuck over here. The ether bridge is an O with a molecule stuck here and a molecule stuck there. For reasons we don't understand, the archaeans have their phospholipids put together like this, and the bacteria and all the eukaryotes, which includes us, have our phospholipids put together with that. And we don't get why, but that's just the way it is. One thing about archaeans that makes them more similar to us is they have more complex DNA control systems than bacteria do. So even though hot springs bacteria grow as slime in a hot spring, they're actually more closely related to you than the bacteria that are growing in most of the bacteria that are growing in your colon right now. You have some archaeans growing in your colon right now, but most of what's growing in your colon are bacteria. The third group in our classification scheme of all life on Earth are the eukaryotes. The eukaryotes are, well, let's get rid of that. I want to go back to the pen. The eukaryotes are us, the eukaryotes, I should say. They are organisms that have cells that have membrane-bound organelles inside. This includes the protists, the fungi, the plants, and animals. And obviously we're in that group. We have very complex DNA control systems, and we have a phospholipid ester cell membrane set up in our cell membranes like the bacteria do. So all three of these groups use DNA to store their information, RNA to process protein production. We have glycolysis. Some of us have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system, and we have very similar cytoskeletal materials. In addition, in eukaryotes, all organisms have membrane-bound organelles, which would include mitochondria and chloroplasts. Now, not all of us have chloroplasts, but eukaryotes include the plants, and plants have chloroplasts and mitochondria, and eukaryotes include the animals, which don't have chloroplasts but also have mitochondria. By the way, I want to point out, all eukaryotes have mitochondria, all of them. Plants, animals, everything. You can't live without mitochondria if you're a eukaryote. Plants also have chloroplasts to feed their mitochondria. You're going to eat lunch to feed your mitochondria. The phospholipids that we were talking about before with the ester linkages, your phospholipids are also shared not just on your cell membranes, but also your nucleus is surrounded by phospholipid membrane, your cell membrane is phospholipid membrane, so is the ER and the Golgi apparatus. Now, this is a cladogram showing the evolutionary history of Earth, and what we have here is kind of, the author was trying to show relative abundances. The bacteria make up most of the biomass on Earth. It turns out archaeans are a bigger fraction than this, but the prokaryotes, more importantly, the prokaryotes outnumber the biomass of the eukaryotes. If you add up all the animals, plants, fungi, all of our weights, we pale in comparison to the weight of all the prokaryotes. It's just the way the world is built. So now that brings us to what is a cladogram? What is a phylogenetic tree? So it turns out phylogenetic trees, meaning we're classifying with genetics, phylogenetic trees and cladograms are graphical representations of evolutionary history. Cladistics is the way we classify now. It's a binary matrix system of classification. So it turns out there are simple ways to go about trying to classify things. And those ways include, let's see if I can get that to stop highlighting. Thank you. Let's go back to my drawing pen. Okay, here we go. There are different cladistical terms used to describe the relatedness between species. Monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic describe three different ways organisms are related. The word reptile is not, okay, so first off, cladistics tries to make groups of organisms that are monophyletic. Monophyletic groups are groups that include descendants and the common ancestor that originated all the descendants. As it turns out, lots of groups that we talk about today are not monophyletic. One of them, for example, is the reptiles. The word reptile includes scaly creatures, which includes turtles, lizards, crocodiles, and archosaurs. But technically speaking, most people who are talking about reptiles are not talking about birds, and if you have a field guide to reptiles to identify a snake in your backyard, it's not going to have any birds in it. Yet the fossil record clearly shows that birds have evolved from reptiles. Therefore, the typical way people use the word reptile is a paraphyletic group. Paraphyletic groups have at least their ancestors and most of the descendants, but at least some of the descendants are missing from the group. So the term reptile is technically a paraphyletic group. The term dinosaur is a monophyletic group, starting with the archosaurs. They're gone now. The birds technically are a monophyletic group. The reptiles, though, are not a monophyletic group. It appears turtles are probably a monophyletic group. What all that means is that the group contains the ancestor and all the descendants. So the primates, like for example, the anthropoids, which include the New World monkeys, the Old World monkeys, apes, and humans, that is a monophyletic group. But if you're talking about like the lorises and the tarsiers, as distinguished from the lemurs, you're talking about a polyphyletic group because you're missing the ancestors back here that relate these three groups. Some people talk about the lorises and the tarsiers separately from the lemurs. As it turns out, they're all three the prosimians. They are alive on Madagascar, and they are related to each other pretty closely and not related to the other groups. So the terms polyphyletic, paraphyletic, and monophyletic are three different ways to describe a group of organisms based on whether or not they contain the descendants and the ancestors. If descendants and ancestors are in the group, monophyletic group. If you're missing descendants but you have the ancestors, you have a paraphyletic group. If you're missing the ancestors but you've got all the descendants, you have a polyphyletic group. And if you are missing both ancestors and descendants, you have a both paraphyletic and polyphyletic group. Again, cladistics tries to make groupings that are strictly monophyletic. And that brings us to, there's a few terms here I guess we can use to describe this. Vertebrates, the presence of bones in the back that house the spinal cord. Vertebrates we think are a monophyletic group. The tetrapods we think probably were a monophyletic group. The amniotes probably a monophyletic group. Reptiles not monophyletic because we usually don't consider birds part of that group. The presence of two large holes in the skull of diapsids, we think that's probably a monophyletic group. Archosaurs, probably a monophyletic group. The last thing to mention in the chapter here is, this chapter is the most controversial chapter probably in AP Bio because there's still so many people that just get like freaked out over the concept of evolution. Ultimately, science is a way of looking at the world that uses the concept that logic and reason will yield the truth. And this then would be the story of the origin of humans. A cladogram. We see an ancient human form here evolving into separate lineages of humans, and Homo sapiens is right down the middle here of the group. Other lateral groups became extinct. This group, only Homo sapiens stayed alive. This shows, the creation, God creating man, completely different concept. This is mysterious. This is reasonable based on what we have from the fossil record. Ultimately, a lot of people get freaked out about this, but the both sides, the evolutionists and the creationists, ultimately are resting their whole argument on belief or faith. Religion is based on mystical explanations, like in Catholicism you have three deities in one God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Science uses logic. I want to point out logic does not always yield the truth. There's plenty of people who have been sentenced to death and died in execution chambers, I'm certain, before we could figure out that they were actually not guilty. A number of people have been taken off of death row by DNA evidence in the last 35 years. In other words, a court of law found them guilty because that was reasonable, but later on we found out that they weren't guilty based on other more significant evidence that wasn't available at trial. Well, that's the way science works. You don't always have the facts. You come up with the best explanation you can, and you have faith that your logic will lead you to the truth. Religious folks believe mysticism will yield them or lead them to the truth. Oddly, the two things have a lot more in common than they want to admit, and if they stop fighting over things, the world would probably be a much better place. That concludes the lecture that we have here on the first big idea, which is how evolution has produced both the diversity and the unity of life.